I'm very happy to be introducing Jim Fadiman. He's also, like Stan Groff, a very amazing man. I see him as like a Renaissance man, and also, as recently was said, he's a luminary in our field. He's been in this field for a long time, and he wears many different hats. He was a co-founder of ATP. He helped Robert Frazier start ITP, the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. He has also been a teacher at San Francisco State, Brandeis. He took over Maslow's position for a while. He also taught at Stanford, and he's taught at IDP. And he had both a Sufi class that he taught, and from what I heard from students, he taught it like a Sufi teacher would teach his students. And as much as they said it was very rigorous, they loved every moment of it. He also taught a class which was called Transformational Fiction. And I can say from my own experience that how he named it was true. I had some very bad experiences with English classes in high school, and I came to really have a strong disdain for writing. And in his class, I went in one quarter, went from hating the notion of writing to really having fun writing. So I really thank you for that, Jim. He also has been a consultant to Lockheed, the Dow Chemical, IBM, American Heart Association. He's done workshops internationally. He's an expert in psychedelic research. He's the author of several books. His recent book is called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, and from what I've heard from people, it's a very useful and very helpful book. He did a good job on that one. He's also very humorous, and I've always enjoyed the many conversations I've had with Jim. He was similar to like Vladimir's experience with Stan. Jim has been very influential in a lot of ways. When I was thinking of doing my dissertation on teaching people the shamanic journey, and I remember talking to him about, well, you know, how do I present this in a way? This is an academic pursuit, this dissertation, and rigorous research. How do I go about talking or languaging about this kind of a bizarre practice? And he says, well, first of all, why don't you stop calling it bizarre? And that changed the whole picture for me, and I really appreciate that also. And also, Jim is one of the reasons that I became a transpersonal psychologist. Back in 1969, there was a conference, I think in Palo Alto, with a lot of the big names at the time, people like Joseph Campbell and Joseph Henderson, and Jim was one of the speakers. And I'll never forget, he introduced himself as a consciousness entertainer. And I went, whoa, because I've been doing consciousness studies for a while at that point. I really liked that image, that I could be a professional and have fun too. And to do this in a way to entertain, it doesn't have to be this serious kind of a pursuit. So I also am very grateful to Jim for that. And in the last ITP-ATP conference that we had in Menlo Park in 2012, he ended his keynote speech with a challenge. And the challenge was, what contribution will you bring to the world? And so I'll say, Jim, this symposium. So, we're here anyway. Without any further accolades, I will pass it on to Jim Fadiman.
Thank you for such a fun introduction, and it's One of the great joys of lasting long enough is when your students say, I actually got something from your course. This is not something those of us who teach now, you don't usually get that much while doing it. So that's wonderful that you appreciate writing. And I have been accused of being humorous. Usually whenever I'm accused of being humorous in an introduction, I try not to be for the rest of the talk. But as Stan has pointed out, consciousness does not originate in the brain. So whoever is running this thing, let's see if we can be serious. And when Steve asked me for a title and I said New Directions in Transpersonal, what that is saying is I have the faintest idea what I'm going to talk about. Can I keep it vague enough so whatever I do will be okay? Because I do have talks which I know what I'm talking about before I start them. That's mainly in the research I'm doing, the research I've done. But when I step back from that and look at transpersonal itself, it's a whole other set of questions. And I think you'll see there's a way of looking at it that most of us haven't considered. Now, just very briefly, by the way, just to be in living context, you're in this auditorium in Sophia University. There was an article in the Journal of Higher Education yesterday about the Sophia being under financial problems, leadership problems. 12 major faculty were fired in December. There's a huge uproar. There's a great deal of unrest and distrust. There's a great deal of fear. So you're really at a very, particularly those of you coming in from Europe, this is like coming into the middle of a soap opera, which is there are more amazing potential visions of what's going on than could possibly fit into this room. And one of the possibilities is that the school will vanish. And I was very relieved to hear this morning that Europe is no longer seeing that we are the be-all and end-all of transpersonal, that they are where perhaps transpersonal is going. And transpersonal has been truly much more successful outside of the United States in using that term and using it as psychology. So even if ITP and its vision has completed itself, there are other schools now, some in the Bay Area, some in Europe, some in South America, actually schools in China, where transpersonal is alive and well. So the title I actually gave for myself when I was going to write this was about successes, extrapolation, and some problems. And the success, and you'll hear a lot more all afternoon, but there is planet-wide interest in transpersonal psychology. And you won't hear this afternoon some of the extraordinary work which is being done in China. We forget, we over here in this kind of rapidly becoming third world country, that there are dozens of cities in China of over 1 million whose names none of us know. But they all have universities, and a number of them have had conferences related to transpersonal. Some of our books have been translated. There is interest because the transpersonal fits in with historic Chinese culture, both Confucian and Taoism, these kind of two alternative worldviews. But both of them are closer to transpersonal than certainly to psychoanalytic. And I loved Stan's comments on psychoanalysis this morning. I have to just let you know. I love parody from the inside. Because I say bad things about psychoanalysis just from guesswork. Now, the other thing that is happening is particularly now where the school does matter in a worldwide sense, is we are continually each year turning out graduates, not only all over the country, but now all over the world. The global program is remarkable in the range of countries that it has, and we are therefore seeding these ideas in many, many places. And one of the nice things about Facebook is people who you don't know and never will, are your friends. And I have a habit when someone says, "Will you be my friend?" is to say, who are you? And what are you doing? And so I have friends in Latvia and in a number of places in India and so forth and so on who share these interests. Now, many times they're personally isolated, or there's a tiny group, but the nice thing when you think kind of biologically or botanically, one seed makes a whole tree. And so you don't need like a overwhelming percentage of the population. You may remember some of the early TM work, the transcendental meditation work, where they said if we can get, I think it was 1% of a city to be meditating, that crime rates go down and so forth, and the data was pretty good. So it doesn't take much to make major changes in a culture, because most people in a culture are basically going along with whatever the culture is doing, because they're trying to just lead their lives. So some of the methods that we see as central to understanding ourselves over these years of transpersonal have been moved from kind of ridiculed fringe to mainstream. Yoga. Now, yoga, as you know, has been primarily dumbed down as a way to stay slim for skinny women in spandex. However, and this is very interesting, however, what's happening now is some yoga classes are saying, you know, what is yoga actually about? Where does it come from? What's the underlying philosophy? And so I'm seeing yoga teachers able now to reintroduce the spiritual system of which yoga is embedded. And that is an exciting kind of second round, like second wave feminism. Well, second wave yoga is going to look a lot like original yoga. Similarly, meditation, certainly it's been sliced and diced and sold in boxes. And mindfulness is this kind of current term. And mindfulness is gained in spread and utility and value. But again, what happens eventually is people say, is there anything other than mindfulness? Does this come from anything? Is this, and then the deeper system that we know it originates from emerges, and of course mindfulness is one of many, many, many ways to train the mind. And the neurochemistry people are now saying, actually when you continually do a practice, that your brain actually adjusts to the practice, just as, if you lift weights with with your arm eventually adjusts to that by developing more muscle. So that meditation, again, what happens for a lot of the things we're interested in, until the materialists can find some way to tie it to measurable physiology, it's really hard for them to take it in. Acupuncture, again, floundered, not because it didn't have 3,000 or 4,000 years of research, but because it didn't have something that Westerners could feel comfortable. And then you got endorphins, and then and so forth and so on, so that things that we're interested in are becoming mainstream. And certainly holotropic breathwork is one of those, which is the nice thing about holotropic breathwork is people get better. And eventually, even the health systems are beginning to realize that people getting better isn't a bad thing. Now, I'm not saying about the pharmacological system, because they really don't want people to get better. But more and more people, also more and more physicians turn out to also want to be healthier too. It's not a great health profession. So visualization, affirmation, self-healing, all this, I would say, are our successes. A central tenet of transpersonal psychology is your own nature is basically good. Now that is a position which I think we would say comes out of our experience, but it's also a philosophic position. Now, what's happened to it is it's gotten, as yoga, kind of debased into positive psychology. And positive psychology, we made a big stab, both humanistic and us, when positive psychology suddenly was popular, to say, it was us actually, it's not those guys. We did it many, many decades ago, and everybody said thank you for sharing and went back to ignoring us. And positive psychology, however, because it says if you teach people to be better, they'll be better, and if you tell them to dwell on what's rotten about themselves, they won't be as better often. And so what's happened to that is it's been debased into a kind of sloganeering. And I will let you know, in case you haven't seen this first issue of Live Happy. That's one word, by the way. The Live Happy magazine is out. And it says on the back, ready for a happier world, it starts with you. Join the movement. Visit mylivehappy.com to join the movement and see your happiness footprint with the Happy Reach app. You don't need to be humorous when reality is right with you. Life is an adventure, why hope matters, begin your year in happiness, etc. So positive psychology, which is again, a kind of tiny slice of what we're about, is out there, and that's a value. And and then again, if you go into the bookstores are crammed with titles about spiritual systems, spiritual practices, self-help on everything from pimples to overweight to trauma, laced with transpersonal ideas and suggestions. So we've had a massive effect on the culture. And one of the things that fascinates me is the psychology section and the self-help section are separate. And I looked at that for years, and then I realized that there are no courses on everything in that huge self-help section in psychology departments. And it's like, what have we been missing, or what have they been missing, we hope? And they are, but the culture basically just walked around mainstream psychology and accepted a lot of what we do. Now, my area of special interest, psychedelics and entheogens, is also getting more and more mainstream acceptance, as is the general world of non-ordinary states or holotropic states. I admit I use the word altered because for me, I love Stan's image this morning, but for a while I still kind of feel altered is like, doesn't bother people. Because altered states, and then you say, well, they say, what's that? I say, well, you've ever slept, had coffee, been drunk, been turned on? I say, oh, yeah, altered states. And I said, there's some others. I say, okay. But again, I'm much more interested in cultural change. I'm not a clinician, I'm not a physician. So I'm kind of watching the waves of the culture and hoping, when I also live in Santa Cruz part-time, so you have a lot of wave imagery and a lot of waves crashing on you imagery. But one of the waves is that we are entering the culture in a much bigger way than transpersonal psychology is. And there was a Stanford Daily editorial, and it included, it is not a moral crime to want to get high. Now that's actually a big cultural shift. Okay, you may recall when basically alcoholism was considered a moral degeneracy. And there are still conditions which we know are not, which are treated the same way. But it is not a moral crime to get high, is saying that the puritanical side of the culture is being balanced by the aliveness side of the culture. And as medical cannabis and non-medical cannabis become common, there'll be treasure troves of research about the effects of mild to serious alterations in consciousness, as well as a new look at spiritual systems that have made use of substances. If I can recommend a book by a very erudite friend who is also a Tibetan Lama, it's called Secret Drugs of Buddhism, which is about one particular lineage of Buddhism that was entirely, seemingly, major rituals, major things, based on correct use of psychedelics. The Eleusinian Mysteries, which lasted 1,500 years, seem to be based on it, and so forth. So there's some remarkable research back into the spiritual systems once we're allowed to look at them. And there's actually a great deal of material within the Sufi traditions as well. By the way, I love the idea that I taught like a Sufi, which I don't. I actually teach like a transpersonal psychologist. Now, out of all of this is also coming work out of South America. And one of the things that's puzzling is, why has ayahuasca, it's a mixture of two plants, why has it suddenly come out of the rainforest where it's been in use for thousands of years and is spreading around the planet? One theory is that ayahuasca is known by the people who've taken it and use it as a teacher. Not as a substance, but as a teacher. And as a teacher, it says things to you. And there has been some wonderful piece of research, for example, where there are 3 research scientists and were stuck on their research problems, took ayahuasca and asked ayahuasca for advice. And ayahuasca basically gave them advice to move their research forward. Now you say, well, how did ayahuasca know about the research on proteins in semen? Which was one of the research questions. And the answer is because ayahuasca may know a lot that you don't. Now again, the idea that plants may know things, that's a little hard for our mainstream psychological brothers and sisters. But again, if you only limit yourself to the evidence, there's a lot that we can learn. From Africa, we have ibogaine, which has, again, remarkable properties in helping long-term addicts not only have an experience that severely suggests to them that not being addicted would be terrific, but they come out of it with a period of time with none of the after effects of stopping drugs. They come into a drug clear period where they actually have time to see whether they can stop their habit. They're not frightened by those terrible physiological changes that normally happen when you stop a major drug. We're learning a lot. Now, my prediction, however, is that we have, and if we look at it, we've made very little headway in formal psychology. I know when I went to Europe, the last time I kind of worked inside a university, the psych department was divided into the cognitive behaviorists and the Freudians, and they didn't talk to each other. And I thought, whoa, in some ways Europe is behind the times, but maybe only in academic departments. And what you have to understand is psychology is not about to welcome us, because we are a threat to their well-being. And Larry LeShan noted many years ago that psychology is trying to be a science. And it's kind of like a little kid trying to be taller. And they just keep reaching. And as Larry described it, if you think of when psychology started inside the university, it looked around and it saw who's getting the new buildings, who's getting the big endowed chairs, who's getting the promotions, where's the action? Is it in the education department? Is it in the religion department? Is it in the philosophy department? Oh, chemistry, physics, biology, botany. Let's go over and hang out with those people. They're the popular kids. And they look at us and they say, you're not a real science. I say, yes, we are. Look, numbers. Look, statistics. Lots of statistics. Look, we can measure physical things. Aren't we real science? No. You're not measuring anything that we think exists. Well, what if we drop all the things that you don't like? I once ran into it, I was with a number of PhD graduate students at Stanford, and I was asking about their research. And the one that just made me sad for weeks was, I'm doing my dissertation on the visual system of ferrets. And I thought, this is a PhD in psychology. And I thought, then what will ferrets get from this research? So it was very nice. That was actually, I think, when I was thinking of stopping teaching at Stanford and just teaching here instead. But I want you to get something quite interesting. The divide between traditional psychology, mainstream psychology, and us extends back to the beginnings of what we might call Western civilization. You might be surprised to learn you're on one side or the other of a millennium-long debate between, just don't go to sleep, between the followers of Plato and the followers of Aristotle. Now, I know you have not been thinking about that recently. So let me bring you up to speed, because to the extent you had an education in psychology, you may have heard their names, but you sure didn't learn anything. So the question that they were both struggling with, and that we're still struggling with, is how can you acquire knowledge of the real, the unchanging, in a world where the most obvious fact is that everything is changing? Now, philosophically, that's a very hard question, and experientially, it's a very hard question. But it's a very good question. And Aristotle and Plato came to different conclusions. Aristotle basically said the truth and the good can be found by studying the natural world, the world of forms, the world of objects, including those we create. That if you study the natural world, you will learn about what is real. Plato says that all those changing forms are versions of the perfect forms they evolved from. That every chair comes from an ideal form of chair, as does every flower and every person. And there is a reality that transcends form. This is the distinction. And it can be approached through study of the forms. So in a sense, if you engross yourself in beauty, you can begin to see the transcendent reality behind beauty, that which emanates and creates beauty. So, given those two, how are you going to get to truth? Let me give you a kind of modern version of it from the Platonic side, which if God is infinite, he can be approached in an infinite number of ways. This is a way of handling the kind of sectarian foolishness. Well, I've simplified past all possibility these two major positions. But you need to see that the argument is not settled, and that most of us are on one side, and that most of science is on the other. And just to make life a little more complicated, and if you're taking notes, you're going to end up with a little box with 4 squares in it. I'm just warning you in advance. And if you can visualize 4 things at once, you're doing fine. 2 kinds of science. One is called evidence-based, which means that all forms of observation are accepted. The other kind of science is, I would call, dogma-based, which also has a term called scientism, which is, there's a whole area of experience, of so forth and so on, which doesn't exist, no matter how many people say it does, because it doesn't fit into our basically dogmatic or religious system, which has a certain Aristotelian taste of it has to be visible, measurable, discoverable by someone not interested, and so forth. So imagine that distinction, and then you say, well, what is transpersonal psychology? I'm a regular psychologist. I don't know I'm an Aristotelian, but I am. And then I read the Association for Transpersonal Psychology, this is today's conference, promoting a vision of the universe as sacred. And I think to myself, these are not my people. Promoting a vision? Sacred universe? Saying this universe sacred? Come on. What's going on? So they basically say, these people are not part of us, both philosophically and also energetically, because to the extent that we bring them into mainstream psychology, the big kids who we're trying to impress will like us even less. So if you can imagine a table here, and Aristotle, Plato, okay? And then on this side, this is hard. Dogma and evidence. Now, Aristotle and dogma are dogma-based scientism is what we would call mainstream psychology, right? Now, where is transpersonal? Here's your fork. It's over on the other corner. It's Plato, Platonic forms, higher consciousness, a divinity behind all things, and evidence. The evidence being observation. The evidence being, for example, are there non-material beings with some kind of intelligence that have something to do with human behavior? Well, the evidence is every single culture but mainstream psychology in the history of the universe says yes. Now, if one has that same little chart, it turns out that transpersonal may fill in the other two pieces of that foursquare as well, with a certain amount of dogmatism and a certain amount of, yes, let's pay attention to the material world. These are the kind of neuroscience people that if I could only understand the brain well enough, I would understand Beethoven. They're nice people, be nice to them. If you see them crossing the street, give them your hand because they're blind. But they're nice. Let me give you a quote from the father of transpersonal. Maslow is considered the father, so this would be the grandfather, William James. He's talking about empiricism, or paying attention to what is. And he's talking about what he calls, in his philosophical terms, radical empiricism. To be radical, an empiricism must neither admit into its construction any element that is not directly experienced, nor exclude from them any element that is directly experienced. What he's saying is, if it's experienced, let's talk about it. If you can't experience it, then let's not. And he has a wonderful comment about when there's an argument between two positions, you ask yourself, does either matter? And if neither matters, you discuss something else. And I admit, when I talk with mainstream psychologists and I say, transpersonal includes all of human experience, I have yet to find one of them that says, so does mainstream psychology. So they know. But they live with it, just as the physics people say, well, we're not measuring the growth of plants because we're dealing with physics. And I say, why? Now, what won't psychology look at? And you heard a certain amount from Stan, which is a little farther than I'm probably going to go, but they basically won't look at the spiritual, the experience or its effects. They really won't look at the major spiritual systems, Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, etc. That's what they won't look at. What they really won't look at is pagan and nature religions, spirits of places, spirits in plants, and what they really, really, really won't look at are the upper and lower worlds, which every shamanistic culture discovers, demons, angels, non-human beings. It's kind of as if the Genesis story where human beings were on the sixth day and then he needed a day off, and as if they don't know what he really was creating on the 7th and 8th days, because it's not in their book. And when Stan says worst of all, of course, what they won't look at, really, 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 really won't look at, is that consciousness does not arise from brain chemistry. Imagine you've been studying that TV set all these years to try and find out why I Love Lucy comes on. And someone finally takes you down to the station. Hard on your life. Max Planck said about quantum physics is, my theories will be accepted when my colleagues are dead. It worked. But murdering your colleagues isn't the answer, so this is definitely not a call to action. Now, let's also look at what transpersonal doesn't like to look at. And I'm not sure why, but my main guess is, and I do know this to be true, there are a lot of people, including a lot of people that teach here, that kind of hope that they will finally be admitted to mainstream psychology. Because then they would be, one of the big kids. So therefore, what do they not study here and many other parts in the transpersonal? A huge amount of parapsychology. And parapsychology is peculiar because it's super empirical. I mean, it absolutely looks like physics. The experiments are so dull and so long and so obvious. And the really cool stuff, even the parapsychologists don't publish. But we don't happen, we did with Arthur Hastings, but it was always a little off to the side. As Stan pointed out, astrology. We really don't do much with astrology. Most altered states, actually, we avoid as well. Spirit guides, ancestors, and spirits. Most transpersonal psychologists, particularly clinical ones, don't deal with it. And to some extent, psychedelic experiences, and of course, plant intelligence is the one that's really tough to include, because once you include all that, will never look like physics. And therefore, you have to really make an internal decision. Is, am I going to try and join the club that doesn't want me and give up my soul? Or am I going to have my soul and never be accepted by the people I'd like to accept? And that's really, particularly if those of you who are students, that's a tough one. Fortunately, the wonderful thing about being a clinical psychologist is you usually take someone into your office and you close the door. Whatever you do in there, who knows? And when people get better, you get other people coming through the door and the system works. Now, let me make a different distinction between, and I look at the regular psychological literature a lot, because for reasons quite puzzling to me, I am a member of APA, and have been for decades. So I read a lot of stuff that goes on. And I have to make a distinction between the worthless and the useless. And this is something I learned as a graduate student, and journals have this wonderful thing they do for you. They put an abstract at the front, and if you just read the abstract, you can then ask the critical question, if so, so what? And your reading of journals goes very, very, very fast. Because an astounding amount of research doesn't pass that test. And that test turns out to be, from my point of view and from William James's point of view, the important test. And I'm not sure that this is fair, but I'm beginning to feel that, having read more and more kind of garbage literature in my area, that peer review may be stuff that only your peers would find publishable. And that this whole system is, in a sense, a kind of version of the old boys network. Now, some of you may remember we had someone in Congress who used to give the Golden Fleece Awards. This was for the most egregious, lousy use of government money. This was the $500 or $5,000 toilet seats and things like that. I'm suggesting to all these organizations that you might consider offering the Golden Insignificance Award for a lot of research that, had it never happened, the world would be exactly as it is. And there is just, there's an amazing amount of research in journals that is not worthless, meaning it does add to human knowledge, but it's useless. It has no real application to anything or to anyone in the real world. And one of the remarkable aspects of the transpersonal is how much of it is useful. How much of our concerns have led to the rise of many, many new therapies, new ways of healing, new worldviews, and support of new social movements. And so my suggestion to you all is psychology is not going to take us in. Get over it. And we will continue to be underappreciated, underpublicized, and enormously powerful in alleviating human ignorance and suffering. Thank you. If we could also have the house lights on, and if we're going to have questions, we have some time for questions. It's a lot easier to see people when I can see them. So if anyone would like to have a question, I think the mic is somewhere. I mean, it is somewhere. And if there are no questions, then you get to have lunch. Oh, I shouldn't have said that, should I? You'll get lunch either way. Okay. I didn't mention my psychedelic work.
Jim?
Yeah.
I just wanted to thank you, because you're at a point in your career where it's easy for me to say that there's a number of people that came to our field with tremendous gifts, and they put 20, 30, 40 years, or however long, of their lives into something. And I empathize with you deeply. That we did think we were going to really change the world in a way we would get recognized. And I empathize and I salute you for putting your whole career into doing it anyway.
Well,
we're not a big crowd here, but you know everybody loves you. And everybody in this room really loves you.
So
if we just add a little extra.
well, my feeling is that we did change the world, we just didn't get credit. See, in my little psychedelic world, you know, people say, well, these drugs are bad for you. And I say, well, 24 million Americans have taken LSD since it became illegal. How bad can it be? And then when you talk about marijuana, you get to up like 140 million, you know. You begin to get that the world is changing, and the people, the last place to change, there are two places which seem to be hard to change. One is the universities, and it's the dark side of tenure, which is once you've got tenure, it's really hard to get rid of you no matter how stale you get. And the other is legislators. And I do a lot of surveys about who has had psychedelics, or as Stan said, you know, unusual experiences. And legislators probably have the lowest percentage of any given group. Judges, physicians, chemists, prosecutors, cops, military, lots and lots and lots, but legislators very few. So that's a curious, if anyone wants to do a dissertation on that, I'll help. So it is nice to be loved, particularly for those who don't understand the Enneagram. I'm that particular position on the Enneagram that thinks that's what you need in life, is people that you don't know that want to love you. So I'm really deeply appreciative. And I wish I'd given my whole career the way Stan has to it, but I actually got caught in what Charlie Grove calls the lull in research. That was the 40 years of total banning research. And I did a lot of other things, and that was helpful because I now really see how widespread our influence has been in the culture. Just as Carl Rogers has a huge influence in a dozen fields, psychology is not one of them. Interesting just to know. So those of you going, and as I say to the students, they never like it when I do, the entering students, is don't worry, when you leave here, there are no job openings that'll say transpersonal psychologist only. So you're actually going to have to go out and be in the world. And I think that's an advantage for the world.